7:46. On Friday evening, July 31st, in downtown Naples, thousands of people are packed into the city center celebrating the 100th anniversary of their football club, SSC Napoli. And then, without warning, the ground under the entire metropolitan area starts to move. Not a gentle tremor. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake, centered just a few miles away near a place called Solfatara di Pozzuoli, violent enough to be felt not just across the city center, but out on the islands of Procida and Ischia, well offshore in the Bay of Naples. I need you to understand exactly what just happened, and where. This wasn't an earthquake in some geologically unremarkable corner of Italy. It struck directly inside Campi Flegrei, the Phlegraean fields, a vast volcanic caldera. Sitting just west of Naples, that's home to more than 500,000 people living inside its officially designated hazard red zone. And this specific earthquake wasn't just another tremor in a region that's had plenty of them lately. Italian authorities and independent seismologists are calling it the strongest earthquake to hit this area in 40 years, surpassing a record that had only been set the year before in 2025. At least 24 people were injured. Several unoccupied buildings collapsed. Part of a coastal cliff crumbled into the sea. Train lines were suspended. The port of Pozzuoli shut down. And by the time the aftershock sequence settled down hours later, residents across the region had felt more than 30 separate tremors in a single evening. So today, we're going to break down exactly what happened, what Campi Flegrei actually is, and why it's considered one of the most closely monitored volcanic systems on Earth, what the science currently says about whether this points toward anything more serious, and what residents and scientists are watching for next. Let's get into it. Let's nail down the specific facts first. At 7:46 p.m. local time on Friday, July 31st, a shallow magnitude 4.7 earthquake struck the Campi Flegrei caldera, with its epicenter located in the Solfatara area of Pozzuoli, according to Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, known by its Italian acronym INGV. Because the earthquake was shallow, it produced disproportionately strong shaking at the surface directly above it, a pattern we've discussed on this channel before with other shallow earthquakes around the world. Less rock between the rupture and the surface means less opportunity for the energy to dissipate before it reaches you. The shaking was felt sharply across Pozzuoli and the nearby town of Baccoli, and reached into the western districts of Naples itself, including Bagnoli and Fuorigrata, all the way into the city center. Reports put the number of injured at somewhere between 21 and 26 people, with at least 2 described as seriously hurt. Several unoccupied buildings collapsed outright, and part of a coastal cliff in the area crumbled as a direct result of the shaking. NGV confirmed at least 10 aftershocks in the hours following the main event, the largest, a magnitude 3.8, that struck around 10 p.m. the same night in the Gulf of Pozzuoli. Local accounts described a broader swarm of more than 30 distinct tremors moving through the region over the course of the evening. Authorities suspended the Cumana and Circumflegrei rail lines, 2 of the local commuter lines serving the Campi Flegrei area, and closed the port of Pozzuoli as a precaution. Many residents chose to spend the night outdoors rather than return to their homes, a genuinely reasonable precaution in the immediate aftermath of a significant earthquake, given that the period right after a main shock is statistically when a large aftershock is most likely to occur. Italy's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Antonio Tajani, addressed the situation directly, stating he was closely following developments in Pozzuoli and across Campi Flegrei, and committing the government to providing full assistance to displaced residents and to finding what he described as a lasting solution for the redevelopment and safety of buildings that have been declared unfit for use. Crucially, INGV has reported no signs pointing toward an imminent volcanic eruption. This was an earthquake, a serious and disruptive one, but the monitoring data available immediately afterward did not show the kind of signals that would indicate magma is actively moving toward the surface. Let's back up and explain exactly what this place is, because supervolcano gets thrown around loosely in headlines, and I want to give you an accurate picture rather than an exaggerated one. Campi Flegrei is a large volcanic caldera, a broad, roughly circular depression formed by the ground collapsing after a massive prior eruption emptied a huge underground magma chamber. It sits directly to the west of Naples, and it's genuinely enormous. The caldera contains 24 separate internal craters and volcanic landforms scattered across its footprint, largely hidden beneath the modern towns, roads, and neighborhoods that have been built across and around it over the centuries. It sits roughly 50 kilometers from Mount Vesuvius, the famous volcano responsible for burying Pompeii in 79 AD, and both volcanoes are part of the same broader Calabrian volcanic arc, a chain of volcanic systems ultimately linked to a nearby subduction zone where one tectonic plate is being forced beneath another. Campi Flegrei's eruptive history includes two genuinely massive events that rank among the largest volcanic eruptions in European history, occurring roughly 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, respectively, eruptions large enough to have significantly affected regional and possibly broader climate patterns at the time. Since then, the system has produced numerous smaller eruptions. Its most recent confirmed eruption occurred in 1538, a shorter, far smaller event that formed a cinder cone now known as Monte Nuovo, still visible in the landscape today. So eruptions here are geologically common on the scale of tens of thousands of years, but historically rare on the scale of human lifetimes, which is exactly why an extended period of unrest like the one currently underway draws such intense scientific attention despite no eruption having occurred in nearly 500 years. The scale of those two prehistoric eruptions is genuinely difficult to convey in ordinary terms. The larger of the two, roughly 40,000 years ago, is thought to have deposited volcanic ash across a huge swath of the surrounding region, and some researchers have linked its climatic aftermath to broader environmental shifts across the Mediterranean and even parts of Europe during that period, though the precise scale of that influence remains an active area of scientific debate. It's genuinely useful to hold both facts about this volcano in your head at once. It is capable, at the extreme end of its geological history, of eruptions large enough to be measured in continental terms, and it has also gone through many centuries at a stretch, including the entire span of recorded human history in this specific region, without producing anything close to that scale of event. The current unrest cycle sits firmly within that second, far more common category of behavior, not the first. To understand why Campi Flegrei has been generating headlines regularly for years now, you need to understand a specific geological process called Bradyseism. Bradyseism describes the slow rise and fall of ground level in a volcanic caldera, driven by the movement of magmatic fluids and gases beneath the surface, without necessarily indicating that an eruption is imminent. Campi Flegrei has experienced this cycle repeatedly throughout recorded history, including a dramatic uplift and seismic crisis in the early 1980s that forced the evacuation of parts of Pozzuoli after the ground rose significantly and produced widespread, if largely minor, structural damage across the town. That 1980s episode is genuinely worth understanding as the closest historical precedent for what residents are living through today. Over the course of that crisis, roughly 40,000 residents of Pozzuoli were evacuated from the town's historic center as ground uplift reached levels significant enough to damage the foundations of numerous buildings, some of which were never fully reoccupied afterward. The episode eventually subsided without an eruption, and much of the town's population gradually returned once the most intense phase of activity passed. That outcome, a genuinely serious, disruptive crisis that nonetheless resolved without volcanic activity, is part of why long-term Campi Flegrei residents and Italian civil protection officials alike tend to treat the current cycle with a specific kind of practiced seriousness rather than either dismissiveness or panic. The region has been through an extended Bradyseismic crisis before, within living memory for many older residents, and it did not end in eruption, even though it required real, disruptive precautionary measures at the time. The current unrest cycle began around 2005, and it has been continuous and notably accelerating ever since. Since that year, the ground near Pozzuoli has risen by more than 140 centimeters, nearly 1.5 meters of cumulative uplift. That's not a smooth, gradual process. It moves in fits and starts, with the rate of seismicity climbing alongside the uplift over time, punctuated by periods of relative quiet followed by sudden bursts of much more intense activity. Independent seismologists studying the system have specifically described the current phase as an active acceleration phase, distinct from the broader, slower-moving unrest that characterized the earlier years of this same cycle. Here's a detail that really puts Friday night's earthquake in context: how quiet the immediately preceding period actually was. During the week of July 13th through 19th, just under 2 weeks before this earthquake, INGV's own weekly bulletin recorded only 8 earthquakes in the entire Campi Flegrei area, none larger than magnitude 0.8, describing seismic activity that week as comparably calm. Ground deformation was continuing at a monitored monthly uplift rate of roughly 10 millimeters, plus or minus 3 millimeters, alongside geochemical readings confirming the long-term trend of the area's hydrothermal system continuing to heat up and produce increased fluid emissions. Based on that data, the bulletin's own assessment was that no significant short-term changes were anticipated, a fairly standard measured statement for a monitoring network watching a system that produces frequent small earthquakes as part of its normal, expected background behavior. Then, less than 2 weeks later, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake struck, instantly becoming the strongest recorded in this specific area in 40 years. That kind of jump from a genuinely quiet 2-week stretch to a record-setting event is exactly the pattern that makes earthquake forecasting at a volcanic system like this one so difficult. It's also worth understanding that this record has now been broken twice in rapid succession. A magnitude 4.6 earthquake in 2025 had itself been described as the strongest in the area in 40 years at the time it occurred. Friday's magnitude 4.7 has now displaced that record just roughly a year later. That pattern, successive records being set and then broken again within a relatively short span, is precisely the trend independent seismologists have specifically flagged as the detail most relevant to understanding where this unrest sequence is currently heading. Here's a genuinely important technical distinction that helps explain why this specific earthquake matters more than the routine, near-daily small tremors Campi Flegrei produces. Most of the earthquakes recorded in this caldera on any given week are small, shallow events tied to the movement of hydrothermal fluid, superheated water and gas circulating through fractured rock close to the surface, broadly similar to the swarm dynamics we've discussed on this channel with other volcanic and geothermal systems. These events are numerous, but individually minor, rarely exceeding magnitude 2 or 3. The larger, more consequential earthquakes at Campi Flegrei, including Friday's magnitude 4.7, tend to occur on something different: a ring fault system, a roughly circular fault structure that traces the buried edge of the ancient caldera collapse itself. Independent analysis of the focal mechanism, essentially the specific pattern of ground motion recorded by seismic instruments that let scientists determine how a fault actually slipped, suggests Friday's earthquake most likely occurred along the caldera's northern ring fault. These ring fault events tend to produce Campi Flegrei's largest recorded earthquakes, specifically because that fault system sits deeper in the crust and appears to have larger, more continuous areas capable of rupturing in a single event, compared to the shallower, more fragmented hydrothermal fracture network responsible for the bulk of the area's day-to-day seismicity. Understanding this distinction matters because it tells scientists something different than a simple magnitude number alone would. An earthquake on the deeper ring fault system reflects stress building up on a structurally significant boundary tied to the caldera's fundamental geometry, not just localized hydrothermal fluid movement near the surface. That's part of why researchers treat this specific event as more analytically significant than its magnitude alone might suggest to someone unfamiliar with the distinction. I want to give you one more piece of historical context, because it actually complicates the "this is the worst it's ever been" framing in an interesting way. During the major Bradyseism crisis of 1982 to 1984, INGV recorded more than 1,300 seismic events in a single month at the peak of that episode, with uplift rates reaching as high as 9 centimeters per month, dramatically faster than the roughly 10 millimeters per month being recorded just before Friday's earthquake. By sheer event count and uplift rate, that earlier crisis was considerably more intense than what's been recorded so far in the current cycle. But here's the nuance worth holding on to. The current unrest cycle, while producing fewer total events and slower uplift than the 1980s crisis at its peak, has now produced a larger single earthquake than that entire earlier episode did. That's a genuinely different kind of pattern, and it's part of why seismologists are cautious about making simple, direct comparisons between the two periods. A slower, more gradual uplift process punctuated by occasional larger individual earthquakes is not automatically less concerning than a faster uplift process that produces more numerous but smaller events. They're different expressions of the same underlying system, and each pattern requires its own careful interpretation rather than a single, universal, worse or better label. So what would actually change the picture here? From concerning but not indicating an imminent eruption to something more urgent? Scientists monitoring Campi Flegrei track several independent data streams simultaneously, similar to the multi-instrument approach we've discussed with other actively monitored volcanoes. Ground deformation, measured continuously via GPS stations and satellite radar, tracks whether uplift is accelerating, decelerating, or shifting in its geographic pattern across the caldera. Gas geochemistry, particularly the ratio of different gases like carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide emitted from the area's fumaroles and hot springs, can shift in ways that reflect changes deep in the system's plumbing, since different gases behave differently as magma or hydrothermal fluid moves and depressurizes at different depths. And seismic monitoring itself goes beyond simply counting earthquakes and their magnitudes, extending to more specialized signals like very long period seismic events, a distinct category of seismic signal, separate from standard earthquakes, that can indicate fluid or gas movement through the subsurface in ways that ordinary brittle rock fracturing earthquakes don't capture. As of Friday's earthquake, INGV's assessment remained that there were no signs pointing toward an imminent eruption. That's a meaningful, specific technical judgment, not just a reassuring soundbite, and it's based on the absence of the kind of coordinated accelerating signals across multiple independent data streams that would typically precede actual magma movement toward the surface. But given how directly this cycle has been described as being in an active acceleration phase, and given the pattern of successive record-breaking earthquakes over just the past couple of years, this is clearly a system scientists expect to keep producing significant headline-generating events for the foreseeable future, even without that escalating further into confirmed volcanic unrest. It's worth understanding why scientists insist on this multi-instrument approach, rather than relying on any single data source, earthquake counts included, to make that determination. A rising earthquake count, or a single larger than usual event, can, on its own, be produced by several different underlying processes, some concerning and some considerably less so. Purely mechanical stress redistribution along the caldera's ring fault system, triggered by the cumulative effect of years of ongoing uplift, can produce a larger earthquake without necessarily reflecting fresh magma actively pushing toward the surface. That's precisely why deformation data, gas geochemistry, and detailed seismic waveform analysis all have to move in a coordinated, mutually reinforcing direction before scientists would treat a change in activity as a genuine signal of escalating volcanic, rather than purely seismic or hydrothermal unrest. A single record-breaking earthquake, even one as significant as Friday's, doesn't meet that bar on its own, which is exactly why INGV's official assessment has remained measured even while acknowledging the broader accelerating trend. If you live in, work in, or have travel plans to the Naples and Campi Flegrei region, here's what actually matters. First, know Italy's official Campi Flegrei alert level system and what it actually means. Italy maintains a color-coded alert scale for this specific volcanic system, and it's worth checking the current official designation directly through Italy's Civil Protection Department, rather than relying solely on how a single dramatic earthquake gets framed in international headlines. Second, if you're anywhere within the officially designated red zone, more than 500,000 people currently live inside it, familiarize yourself with your household's specific evacuation plan. Italian authorities have developed detailed, area-specific evacuation procedures for this exact region precisely because of its dense population living atop an active caldera system. And knowing your own designated route and assembly point in advance matters far more in the moment than trying to figure it out during an actual emergency. Third, treat aftershock risks seriously in the days immediately following an event like Friday's. Many residents chose to spend that first night outdoors, and that's a genuinely reasonable, evidence-based precaution anytime a significant earthquake has just struck, particularly in a region with a documented mix of older, potentially vulnerable building stock alongside newer, better engineered construction. And fourth, if you have travel plans to Naples or the surrounding area, expect the possibility of continued localized disruption, particularly to the Cumana and Circumflegrei rail lines, and potentially port operations at Pozzuoli, and check directly with your transportation providers, given how recently this specific earthquake affected regional infrastructure. So here's where this stands as of today. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake struck the Campi Flegrei caldera on Friday evening, July 31st, the strongest recorded in the area in 40 years, injuring more than 24 people, damaging buildings and disrupting rail and port infrastructure across the region. It struck a volcanic system that's been in a continuous, increasingly active state of unrest since 2005, with ground near Pozzuoli having risen more than 140 centimeters over that period, and it followed a genuinely quiet 2-week stretch that gave little immediate warning of what was coming. Italian authorities and INGV have found no signs pointing toward an imminent eruption, but the broader pattern, successive record-breaking earthquakes, an active acceleration phase in the underlying Bradyseism cycle, and a deep, structurally significant ring fault system capable of producing exactly this kind of larger event, means scientists are watching this system with real, sustained attention rather than treating Friday's earthquake as an isolated anomaly. I'll be tracking Campi Flegrei's seismic and deformation data over the coming weeks, particularly watching whether this represents a temporary spike in an otherwise gradually escalating pattern, or the start of a more sustained, intensified phase of activity. This is exactly the kind of slow-building story where the individual headlines can feel disconnected unless you're tracking the full underlying pattern, and I'd rather give you that fuller picture than just react to each new record-breaking earthquake as it happens. If breakdowns like this help you understand the real science behind a place this consequential, subscribe, because I'll have the update the moment this picture meaningfully changes. I'll see you in the next one.